Welcome to episode 54 of the World Builder's Anvil. And as always, I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. And today's topic is not what I said last time, and I apologize on that. Today's topic is Welcome to the Kingdom of Baurhdrakkas. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Now, welcome back, and let me explain for a second what happened. Essentially, I've talked about this before, you try and get ahead in what you're doing, and I was, but unfortunately, due to circumstances in life, some very tough family stuff has come up, and it's got me behind, and my story's not quite where I want it yet, so I'm hoping to do that next Friday. So instead, I'm doing something else I was planning to do later, which is start talking a bit about my world, and try and give you examples of how I develop something. And I'm starting with the Kingdom of Baurhdrakkas for a few reasons. One, it is an early kingdom in my world that takes place. It's very important to the formation of the area in which I'm going to talk about early on. But what I would like to do is take a few moments just to talk about the inspirations and then sort of go through all of the things that I talked about in my show with this kingdom to give you an idea of how I got from my inspirations, taking the geography of the world I was on, and trying to apply it back to the state. So I'll be going into cultures and everything along the path. This will be broken up in several episodes. This will just be the first one, and it'll be on just inspirations. Okay, so one of the things I like to think of that inspired me was sort of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, or the Teutoburg Forest, excuse me. It's this forest in Germany where Rome was soundly defeated during the reign of Caesar Augustus. And that led to the formation, not really the formation of a German state, but it kept the Romans from dominating the area they call Germania. And it's not the battle itself that really is the inspiration, but it's a couple things from there. There are these things called the ancient German tribes, the Germanic people. And it's this big eclectic groupings of cultures in a certain part of Europe. And they were kind of spread out over a while, over vast tracts of land, if you want to say. And really kind of came to dominate Western and Northern Europe for a long time. And they kind of grew into the sort of modern Western and Northern European cultures that we know today. The thing that caught my mind was that there was this German people who beat them. But I also learned in school about the unification of Germany, which I believe was in 1871. And someone will let me know if I'm wrong with that. And I always wondered how come, if these were the German people, how come Germany didn't form until 1871? And I was naive, but it sort of sparked my curiosity. And it led me through this massive journey, And this is really where I started learning a lot about what cultures are. But the Baurhdrakkas culture, it's really the Baurhdrakkan culture, essentially it is probably one of the most heavily developed I have. And I kind of consider it a prototype culture, much like the Germanic culture was. It's a group of closely related individuals that have similar language and similar religious beliefs that come into this portion of the world. And much like the Germanic people did, they migrated into what I call the arm of the world, which is my manipulation of the geography of Europe. And it's quite obvious when you see the map of Gardul that it's sort of this broken up version a little bit of Eurasia and Africa. And it's more complicated than that. And as I go more into my world, I'll explain a bit more of why I made the decisions I did with geography and why I chose to pick something that was close to kind of what people would see. It kind of looks related, like maybe from a distance, if you squint your eyes, you might confuse it. And it's not meant so much to drastically tie in the cultures, and geography kind of breaks that up from happening. I didn't want a Europe so much as we thought of, but I wanted to explore some of the things that I learned in the cultures in Europe. And some of the ones I found really fascinating. The other one I always found really fascinating was the Italians. And same thing, is you have this place, Italy, and it just comes up, right around the same time that Germany does. But, it's been there forever. Why did Italy just appear? What is a kingdom? These are all things that sort of led me in this mind thing towards Germany. And then some of my ancestry is from German. Ingram is a German name originally, and it's sort of grown out and sparked off into different countries. I don't know how far back I'd have to go to have an actual German relative. And I'm not really super impressed with Germany as a culture as much as I am of this idea of the beautiful thing with Germany and Europe was being in the middle. It had collisions with the West and the East and the South and the North. And so it got influenced sort of from all areas of Europe. And there are effects, if you go around Germany, your local cultures are sort of affected by that. And that idea I kind of wanted to express when I went to the arm of the world. The Francesa. And I'm probably horribly mispronouncing that. I apologize. It was the Frankish throwing axe. And this is the thing that really propelled the Franks in France, who were a Germanic people. Whatever that really means, I don't know. Except for this sort of super proto-culture. But this axe and the Franks, because of this axe, came to dominate the world. And it always fascinated me that, the Franks were named after their weapon. And so one of the things, and you'll see this when I break down the Baurhdrakkan culture more specifically, there are subcultures in there, and they actually all are derived from weapon names in their language. And it's strictly a homage back to that weapon, which was so important that it formed this huge empire post-Rome and sort of started the path of Europe down towards Catholicism, away from paganism. Now, another thing that fascinated me, and it was an inspiration for this, was the Principalities of Galadria and Mystera, which is a Dungeons and Dragons game world. It's one I played in a lot when I was a kid. And this is one that fascinated me because I always loved mages. That country was a magocracy, as they would call it, I think in their terms. It's this place where you had to be a mage to rule. And that has no influence over here, but was this idea of they were princes. And before that time, and I was young when I read this, you think, well, you have kingdoms with kings, and the idea that you have a principality, and that means there's no kings. What does that mean? And that kind of goes back to the other question I had before, is what is a kingdom? And a kingdom is really, in the Western sense, it's not a thing led by a king. That's what it meant in Europe in a way, but it really meant a kingdom was, the kingdom of the Franks, Francia. That would be a kingdom because it was of the Frank people. And Charlemagne turned it into an empire because he conquered several different peoples, several kingdoms, so he became an emperor. And post-Rome, I think that's kind of what the idea of what kingdoms and empire came to mean. And I found it interesting. I love this idea of princes. I remember reading a lot too, and you have these early republics, which really weren't republics in what we think of them, but they had elected kings. And not as powerful as like a king in later Europe, but they would have these people who would swear blood oaths to them. And they would be willing to give their life, in theory, to protect their king once he was elected. And he would have his men around him. And part of that helped lead into the modern sense of what knights are. And this is kind of the stuff that went into my brain as I'm starting to come up with this culture. And this culture is largely the reason the geography is this way. And there's some other cultures here, and I get into some more modern European style cultures in this area because of it. I like to keep them grouped together because I think it makes sense to me logically that, similar types of effects are going to cause similar things, but I don't think they're going to be like, what you think of as Germany. I don't think it is. And I hope you don't either. Because there really went into a lot of thought into the way this formed. I wanted some of the similar traits, this idea that we're not going to be oppressed by a foreign superior power. There are some stories with that early on leading into this time period. And actually, this kingdom is ended in misery because of that. But it will lead to this later kingdom of Baurhdrakkas. And that kingdom is actually very much, a breakaway sentiment of all of these sort of tensions. And it's sort of, I like the East-West tension of the old Cold War. And I try to pull some feelings out of that in this area between human and orcish culture. This area of fighting for supremacy. Even though it's really in a relatively small scale part of my world, this area is landmass-wise not as big as Europe would be. It's smaller. It's relatively big, but it's not in the scope that Europe is. There's a lot more water. There's an inner sea very much like the Mediterranean to the south of the area. However, it's a bit larger. It's a bit more round. It's not elongated. So there isn't quite the easiness to keep cultures separated around there. There are some other tribal groups that are in this part of the world. There's some other tribal groups to the south. And the kingdom of Baurhdrakkas kind of rose out of the Baurhdrakkan culture up near the top of the arm of the world. Now, another thing that influenced me in building this was the Order of Knights from Dragonlance. And I don't even remember this super specifically. However, I do remember being fascinated that they had these different kingdoms, and it's much like they had the different orders of mages, and what is an order. And that led me into studying a lot about feudalism and the idea of what it was to be noble and what it was. And it does vary more than people think it does. But what does it mean to be a noble? What does it mean to be a peasant or a serf? What's the difference? Why were some peasants called serfs and some were called peasants? What was the difference? Or we classify them differently. So a lot of these are the kinds of questions I wanted to explore in this part of the world, because it's something that made sense to me. It had a huge impact on Western culture. Really, in other parts of the world, you have your own forms of feudalism, but they're slightly different, even though ultimately it's kind of the same thing, just with different dressing, different names. But and actually, some of this kingdom started. Some of my first world building were building knighthoods, because I was fleshing out Dragonlance because I found it interesting. Especially when they added in that continent where they had the Minotaurs that were dressed like Romans. I found it really cool because the first culture that really interested me was Rome, because they were a dominant power in Europe, and you saw it on the maps when you were in school. Like, wow, these guys, who are they? And you know nothing about them really, because you don't learn very much, but you learn a lot about them over time, especially outside of school. These are the things that sort of form in and give me the ideas of the things I want to explore when I'm telling stories. And ultimately, I wanted to get to a kingdom without a king, to sort of keep up my whole prince mantra, but call it a kingdom, because the kingdom is really culturally dominated. And to them, much like it was to Europeans, the idea of a kingdom is a cultural thing. And watching the development of that is something that I found interesting as I was growing my world. So when you kind of wrap up all of these items, you take some of the modifications I did in the geography, and you start exploring with weather patterns and the interactions of the inner sea versus the outer sea. And straight up through the middle, there are some dominant mountain ranges that split up my Europe-like thing very drastically. And so over time, it allows the cultures to grow distinctly different from each other, even though they came from this basic group that started somewhere near the center of my world and migrated up through the entire length of the arm of the world and came to dominate part of the region for periods of time. Now, the rating for this episode, there is none. I don't rate my own stuff because it's done. So, I guess it's super basic because it's done. However, we are going to still have a world building task for the day. That is, take a state you have developed before you listen to the show, or prepare another state that you're going to develop, and just go through and come up with some of the things that actually excite you, or things that you want to explore or talk about. And you're going to see that, some of these things I list as inspirations, there's no battle of the Teutoburg Forest in my world. That battle never happened. But it was because of that battle that led me to other things, which helped lead me to some of the ideas that made me want to explore these kind of cultural groups. And obviously, there's a Western bent on them because that's what I grew up learning about. And, I try to go and explore the things too. And when I get into different areas of the world, I'll start covering some of those things that fascinate me as well. Now, the real world task for the day. And this is more of an advice based off of my current situation is do your best, irregardless of what happens in life, to keep your word. And my word right now is I'm going to produce 4 shows a week. And even though all my extra episodes I burned out and I'm through and I can't do exactly the episode I wanted to deliver, I'm delivering an episode that I do want to deliver at some point. I'm just shifting the order around a little bit to make sure that you can get the episode and I believe a good episode that will lead into an interesting series of episodes moving forward. And you're going to see some more of me talking about Baurhdrakkas going into the future because of this too. You're going to see me talking about different facets of the world that I find very interesting. But right now I'm going to be focused on this part of the world, but I'm going to go into the cosmology of it. I'm going to go into the geography of the area and talk about basic history of the cultural group moving up there. And at the time, I'm going to explain a bit about the culture. And then I'm going to explain about this specific state, Baurhdrakkas. And it'll take a series of episodes to do it. Not as many as it took me to explain the idea of how I do this. I'm not going to go into all of that detail. But I'm going to talk about all of the basics about it. And then, give a brief history of it. Because this is really what I consider an important predicate kingdom in my world for where my storytelling is going to start taking place at. It's actually, this kingdom's gone. But it is important for the kingdom and what is the major force that's happening that's sort of going on in the world a few years in the future after the kingdom of Baurhdrakkas comes back. The tease for this episode is an interview with world builder and storyteller Monica Spaeth. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike, while the myth rolls high.